Welcome to your 7th podcast on Shakespeare. Today we're going to be discussing the chronology of Shakespeare's plays. Now, this is not set in stone. Please remember that these dates are guesses, estimates that we have for many things. Sometimes when the text is printed, we have a date, but we are not always certain of the performance date. Notice that the print date comes after the performance date because, as I mentioned in the last podcast, Shakespeare's troupe would want to keep the text to themselves in order to take advantage of it, benefit from it as much as possible before printing it. Sometimes they would print it a bit early because, for example, as in the case of Hamlet, a text came out 1601 is the performance date, but a text came out early, 1603, which shows that the play was successful, but this was an early and probably pirated text. So the company came out with another text, and between those two, we called the first one Q1, Quarto 1, the second one is Quarto 2, and I'm also going to talk about folios. So the quartos and the folios are what we see here. Let me go back to explain this a little more thoroughly. So we have our plays here, suggested performance dates, whether it's something in Henslow's diary that tells us that the plays were commissioned, that they brought in a certain amount of money on these dates, or something that was entered at the stationers. We're certainly uncertain about the performance dates, but we've made some very, I would say, accurate scholarly guesses that give us a range of time. Now, over here, when things are printed, as I mentioned, any printing before 1623 would be a quarto. And a quarto is simply that it is folded twice, making a 4-page piece from a larger piece of paper. There are 4 folios for Shakespeare, 1623, 1632, 1663, and 1685. Those are the dates of the 4 folios, and the changes between those folios are hardly substantive, mostly just typographical errors and corrections between them. However, there are vast differences between the quartos sometimes and the folio, as for example in King Lear, as in Hamlet, and in other plays. So I want you to be aware that when we talk about Hamlet, quite often we're talking about a text where we have put in the best lines of both the quarto and the folio, or King Lear could be the same thing as well. So there may be more than one Hamlet out there, and you need to know that. So performance dates and the plays, and then I have my print dates. If it's printed before 1623, you should assume that that was a fairly successful play, and that means that the public wanted to read it, or it was pirated, and that shows that there was public interest in it. Notice where Shakespeare begins. He's probably writing in collaboration with a few other playwrights here. We think that he began with Henry VI, Part 2 and Part 3. This is one where I said there is an open-ended denouement. At the end of Part 2, they rush off the stage and they rush on in Henry VI, Part 3. Dating Henry VI, Part 1 is a little more difficult because it's a quite different play from these two, and scholars are quite good at arguing which came first, Part 1 or Parts 2 and 3. I've kept this order because the dates seem to me convincing for when Part 1 was actually staged. We're not going to read those plays, but I want you to remember this is the first tetralogy. It ends with Richard III. So I take English history as my first subject, and whether he wanted it or not is really not the question. He was actually quite good at it, good enough to make Marlowe a bit jealous, Christopher Marlowe, the only other English playwright who comes close really to Shakespeare. So At this time, he makes Marlowe jealous. Marlowe borrows what he does here in the Henry VI plays to write his own play, Edward II, and Shakespeare's going to, I would say, not borrow from, but be inspired by Edward II to write his Richard II. So some interesting intertwining with the two playwrights. So my first tetralogy is here, but again, this is the second half of the War of the Roses. Then I have some comedy. This is a comedy from Plautus, a Roman playwright who's borrowing from some of the Greek plays. So the Comedy of Errors, an early comedy, funny, but not quite as complex as what you'll see already by the time of the writing of The Taming of the Shrew. Titus Andronicus as well comes from Roman history. So I'm looking at my English history and I'm looking at Roman history here. Seneca is the Roman tragic playwright that he's looking at to write Titus Andronicus. I'm looking at the Romans for inspiration. He comes back home for inspiration with The Taming of the Shrew, in that the induction is based in England, and most interestingly, near to Shakespeare's home. And then it moves elsewhere from there. I get interested in Italy here. I'm interested in France here, and Romeo and Juliet, of course, in Italy. But then I come back. It seems that I'm successful with my history plays, or the company realizes that success and they want more of those. So the history plays begin again. Richard II, King John, which is a standalone history play. Apparently not terribly successful at the time, because it wasn't printed until the folio. And then I have my Henry IV, Henry V, interspersed with some of the more famous comedies. And of course The Merchant of Venice, which I would call a problem play. Hardly comic in some of its content, but certainly one of interest. Julius Caesar marks the period where I am now in the Globe. All right, the Globe was built in 1599 by timbers from the theater where they had been performing and where they lost their lease. And they literally carried the timbers over to across the river to a new location, and that is the location of the Globe. It was built in 1599. One of the first plays staged there was Julius Caesar. And after that, you have As You Like It, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, notice 1600, so I kind of jump in the tragic mode from the Latin history of Julius Caesar to Hamlet. I take a brief, fun look at England again with the Merry Wives of Windsor, and then Troilus and Cressida, looking at the Iliad and rethinking the Iliad. The latter period here, I would call anything after, from Hamlet forward, kind of a turning point. The plays certainly change. I have problem plays like Measure for Measure, and I have that wonderful uninterrupted cycle of the major tragedies, starting with the Latin Julius Caesar, but then Hamlet, Othello, King Lear, Macbeth, and ending with Coriolanus, of course, but again, not a great success. It wasn't published until the folio. The final cycle of plays are known as reconciliation plays. These are plays where I forgive. And it seems that the tragedy that opens some of these plays, for example in Pericles, which Shakespeare may not have had a great hand in writing, but certainly did for Cymbeline and beyond, through The Tempest. In these plays, I begin with something tragic, for example, the burning of the boat and the dispersion of the nobles on this terrible island that is Prospero's in The Tempest, but I end with something positive. Notice as well, publication dates are rather late, except for this one, Pericles. These latter two plays I've included, but I'm not able to say to what extent Shakespeare's responsible for the structure or for much of the verse. So please be aware, if you read these plays, you're looking at John Fletcher's work for the most part, and perhaps Shakespeare helping him, as Fletcher was one of the up-and-coming playwrights of the time. And that concludes our discussion of Shakespeare's plays.